Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on what time zone you're joining us from, for this very important webinar hosted by Hong Kong Watch on this important day, a day where we mark four significant anniversaries: the 24th anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong, the first anniversary of the imposition of the draconian national security law, the 100th birthday of the Chinese Communist Party, and also the first anniversary of the British government's announcement of its very generous and courageous offer to Hong Kong British national overseas. And I think most of us would agree that only one of those anniversaries is one that we can mark with some degree of gratitude, and the other three really are, in a sense, a day of mourning. And to help us examine the issues underlying these anniversaries, it's a privilege to be joined by an extremely distinguished panel. The former Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, who served for the last 2 years before the handover, Sir Malcolm Rifkind. United States Congressman Chris Smith, who has served in the US Congress since 1980, served twice as the chairman of the Congressional Executive Commission on China, co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in the past, and also has served as chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee's Subcommittee on Human Rights and International Operations, and has been a leading voice on human rights around the world, and particularly China, for many years. Jenny Kwan is a member of the Canadian House of Commons, born in Hong Kong, emigrated to Canada at the age of 9, was elected as the youngest ever member of the Vancouver City Council, served for many years in the British Columbia legislature before being elected to the Parliament of Canada. And Ray Wong, who is the founder of Hong Kong Indigenous, left Hong Kong in 2017, and in 2018 became the first Hong Kong recognized refugee, recognized as an asylum seeker by Germany. Just before we go into our panel, and we'll hear from our four speakers, just two housekeeping points. The first is that we will have a Q&A after we've heard from our panel, and you can send your questions through the chat function to me, and I will share the questions with the panel and try and direct them the questions as much as I can and get through as many as we can. And I think everyone has done this, so I don't need to say this, but if you can keep yourselves muted and your cameras off, apart from the speakers, that would be very helpful. We are broadcasting on Facebook Live as well, and questions can come in from Facebook Live to me as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to ask Sir Malcolm Rifkind, who, as well as having served as Foreign Secretary and in several other senior cabinet positions, also serves now as one of Hong Kong Watch's patrons. And so, Sir Malcolm, we're delighted to have you with us, and over to you.
Well, Ben, thank you very, very much indeed. Delighted to be taking part in this panel. And all congratulations to Hong Kong Watch for keeping the public eye very firmly focused on what's happening in Hong Kong. I'm going to speak very briefly in these introductory comments. But the first point I want to raise, I was, for the benefit of your viewers, I was the British Foreign Secretary at the time of the transfer of Hong Kong. And of course, it's worth remembering that at that time, it was very uncertain there would be any future, even in the short term, for the political liberties of the people of Hong Kong. Legally, China was entitled to have the return of the colony under the original treaty. It was a 100-year treaty, which was running out. And in addition to that, there was, of course, no way you could militarily defend Hong Kong if there had been a real likelihood of conflict with the Chinese government. So having said that, what was the stroke of good fortune, it appeared, was Deng Xiaoping's proposal, and it was a Chinese proposal, of two systems in one country. And it's worth recording, in the rather gloomy state we are now, two systems has survived for 24 years relatively successfully. The Chinese tried to nibble away at it at various occasions, but usually failed. but for half the period of the treaty, the two-systems system has operated. But where are we now? And it is easy to answer. It's a very, very serious situation indeed. For all practical purposes, political freedom in Hong Kong has been extinguished because of the national security law and the way in which it is being enforced. But it's not just political activists in Hong Kong who have freedom threat. It is, of course, also the whole population of the territory, because the single most important thing, I remember being told this at the time by the people of Hong Kong when I visited it before my final visit to Beijing, they were anxious to preserve the rule of law, the fact they would have independent judges and both on personal matters and on corporate matters. And of course, that too is now under threat, because the last word on any legal matter in Hong Kong will ultimately be determined in the same way as in mainland China by the Communist Party as the government of what is a totalitarian state. So there is an immediate issue whether British judges who at the moment serve on the appeal court, final appeal court of Hong Kong, whether they should stand down. There's been a debate about that. Really, it's about when they do so, not whether. And my own view is very simply that if and when they are required as judges to implement laws that were actually initiated in Beijing, not by Hong Kong's elected council, that should be the time when they say, sorry, we are not prepared to be party to this. Now, I think the crucial question now, trying to look forward in the 2 or 3 more minutes I'm going to speak, is there any leverage that the United Kingdom and the international community have? Not to reverse what's happened. I'm not going to pretend that is a serious option in the short to medium term. But do we have leverage to minimize the damage being done to the liberties and life of the people of Hong Kong? We have some, but it would be a mistake to think it's very much. The Chinese government still attach a lot of importance to the economic contribution Hong Kong makes to the Chinese wider economy. It's not as important as it was in 1997, but a heck of a lot of investment in China goes through Hong Kong, and it's the Hong Kong legal system based on English common law, which many international companies choose as the basis of their commercial involvement in the territory. So that gives us a bit of leverage, because the Chinese don't want to lose that. The second leverage we have, again, I don't want to exaggerate it, but it's there. One of the original reasons Deng Xiaoping wanted two systems wasn't just to be nice to Hong Kong. It was to try and persuade the people of Taiwan that you can rejoin the motherland peacefully and still retain your own political, social, and economic system. Well, that didn't carry much credibility with the Taiwanese in the past. It's pretty well zero now, but who knows, that factor may have some weight. And I think the third consideration is the Chinese government have been desperate to argue that this is purely a local matter. It's no business of the United Kingdom, and certainly not of the rest of the world. Well, they failed in that already. And the very fact that Congressman Smith's here and the support that has been received from a substantial number of other countries shows that this is a global issue. And why is it a global issue? Partly because of Hong Kong itself, but we also have the knowledge that the Chinese government loathe the fact that there are other misdeeds, whether it's on the treatment of the Uyghurs, whether it's their threats to Taiwan and other territories in that part of the world. These are now global issues which have totally changed the views not only amongst governments, but in public opinion in large parts of the world as to dealing with China. Very, very final point. If I was a member, the unlikely possibility of my being a member of the Chinese Politburo, I wouldn't be saying what I'm about to say publicly, but I'd be beginning to wonder whether Xi Jinping is such a brilliant strategist. Because although in the short term, China's huge strength can deliver all these things that are happening, not just in Hong Kong, but with the Uyghurs and various other disputes, what he has done for the first time is to unite, never mind just America or Britain or Europe. He's uniting all China's own Asian neighbors, all highly developed countries, strong economies, significant military, whether it's Japan, South Korea, Taiwan itself, and then going further south, Vietnam, communist Vietnam, now sees America more as an ally than China. And India, most important of all. So final point, we now have something called the Indo-Pacific region. There's only one reason why generals and diplomats, congressmen, British members of parliament, journalists talk about the Indo-Pacific, because for the first time in history, all China's neighbors, stretching from India on one side to Japan at the other side, are increasingly not forming a military alliance. We're some way away from that, though it might happen, but coordinating their activities. And only in the last few days, we've had, for the first time in this sense, United States and Japan conducting major naval exercises in the South China, East China seas. Now, that's not a brilliant success for Chinese strategy. So hopefully some thoughtful people in Beijing will be beginning to ask, yeah, we can win the tactics, but are we really winning the strategy when we're uniting all our Asian neighbors and the United States and India and Australia against us because of our tactics? So that's the final point I would make. Thank you very much.
Well, Sir Malcolm Rifkind, thank you very much indeed for that fascinating and extremely comprehensive opening statement. I was just told earlier that my audio was not very good, so I've put headphones on. I hope that improves the audio, and it may make me look more like a telephone operator, but at least you can hear me better. Congressman Chris Smith, it's a great privilege to be joined by you from Washington, D.C. Congressman Smith is a hero of mine, an old friend of mine, and particularly on this day where I know from just half an hour ago you called me and you're in the midst of a really important vote. It's extremely good of you to join us. We'd love to hear from you now.
Thank you so very much, Ben. And I want to thank you especially for the extraordinary work you have done, not only chronicling the human rights abuse in Hong Kong, but getting all of us on the same page. Your information has always been actionable and accurate, and what a difference your advocacy has made. You know, there will be a better time for the people of Hong Kong, and I can't say how much all of us on this side of the Atlantic feel for your work. It is extraordinary, and it is going and is making a difference. So thank you, Ben, so much for that. And to be on a panel with such very distinguished individuals, the former Minister Rifkind, thank you for your leadership and your comments just a moment ago. They're excellent. And all of us on the panel and all of us who believe in human rights know that every person in China deserves better than the brutality that so many endure and the systematic violations of their universally recognized human rights. Tragically, under Xi Jinping, human rights abuse throughout China has significantly worsened across the board. I've chaired hearings on the pervasive use of torture and heard individuals tell what they have gone through, including the chair and all of the other horrific and terrible tortures that are visited upon them. Religious persecution has skyrocketed. The whole idea of synodization, where you know, everything has to comport with Xi Jinping's principles. It's all about control and manipulation. Trafficking, human trafficking. China is a tier 3 country. I wrote our law called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in the year 2000. And we have tiers for how badly or poorly a country is doing. China is a tier 3 country for forced and sex trafficking. And many of the sex trafficking problems are directly attributable to their forced abortion policy and the missing 60 million females, girls, and now women killed over time simply because they were girls. So there's a unfortunately, the traffickers bring in women, and that's all attributable to policy by the PRC. In addition, 2 American administrations, as you know, have determined that China is committing genocide in Xinjiang province, to say nothing of what they've done and have continued to do against the Tibetans, the Mongols, and of course, the Hong Kongers. In Hong Kong, the basic law has been eviscerated, as we all know. The Sino-UK agreement, which is international law, and Minister Rifkind can tell us all chapter and verse on all of that, as can you, Ben. And yet they break it with impunity. No tyranny, however, need be forever. And, you know, dictatorships, as long as they are challenged comprehensively and aggressively and wisely, need not be forever. So solemn promises, as we all know, are by Xi Jinping and his predecessors are rarely kept. But I find that too many leaders in the world are far too eager to blindly accept fiction over fact. You know, very often there is a fatigue, compassion fatigue, human rights fatigue, call it whatever you want, where people just too quickly turn the page and say, well, now let's start dealing with the PRC, do more trade, do whatever, even though they've gotten worse. You know, I believe we lost China from an American perspective. In May 26, 1994, Bill Clinton delinked human rights from what we call most favored trading status, which gives the ability of the Chinese to export their goods, and they are, of course, an exporting economy, a favorable treatment rather than a more difficult treatment with tariffs and the like. He did this on a Friday afternoon when nobody was looking. We had a consensus among Democrats and Republicans, and I'm a Republican, that we wanted serious and substantial progress in human rights, or they don't get the trading relationship. He severed that policy, and we never, ever got it back. I've introduced legislation that would reimpose it to say we want trade with China, but if and only if human rights are moving in the right direction with significant progress. This is also the case where people turn the blind eye with the International Olympic Committee Evaluation Commission in 2015. As Xi Jinping was actually planning, not only was he, the umbrella revolution that started back in 2014, at least many of us put bills in then, I did, including the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, couldn't get it passed because the Sino watchers in DC were saying, oh, that'll only make it worse, rather than saying, we need to tell him unambiguously that there are penalties if you cross these lines. And we got my law passed in 2019. I was the author of it, and it has all kinds of sanctions, and those sanctions have been meted out, not as robustly as I would like, but they have been meted out by both the previous and this administration. But it's a little too late and too late. But the IOC took the word of the Chinese diplomats that they were going to improve human rights. I have asked the IOC repeatedly, where are those commitments? What's the penalty? But where are those commitments that were given? It's all secrecy, and I think that's absurd. This isn't a nuclear issue, or as we would say here, the Manhattan Project going back to World War II. This should be totally transparent as to what those commitments were. I chaired a hearing on the Beijing Genocide Olympics. I've done many hearings on Hong Kong, as you know, Ben, as chairman of the Lantos Commission and also the Human Rights Committee on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And on May 18th was talking about a change of venue, move it to a new area, new city, another country, or boycott. It's not too late to do that. And I'm worried that there will be a minimalist policy of a diplomatic boycott, which is not even a slap on the wrist of Xi Jinping, and he will have his big days celebrating the Chinese governance model. One of our witnesses, Samuel Chu, put it really well at the hearing, and I'm coming to the end here. And he said, Samuel, as we all know, is just a tremendous leader. And Samuel said, hosting the Olympics has become the go-to proven solution for authoritarian regimes to whitewash their crimes, boost their image internationally, and strengthen alliances. And worse, China used the 2008 Olympics as a catalyst for expanding its security and surveillance apparatus. Parenthetically, Frank Wolf and I, another congressman, went before those Olympics in 08 began and had press conferences and said, look what the Chinese dictatorship is doing. They're rounding up the dissidents, the human rights activists, so they can't even talk to the press. No lessons learned when 2015 rolled around and the IOC then said, okay, China, you can have the Winter Olympics in 2022. I thought Samuel Chu again made an excellent point. He said, the World Anti-Doping Agency has banned Russia from playing and hosting in all major sports, including the Olympics. And he says, Russia, for the crime of doping, is banned from the games hosted by a regime, but you can commit the horrific abuses against the Hong Kongers, and you can commit the abuses against the Tibetans and the Muslim Uyghurs, and you can host the Olympics. It's like 1936 all over again. So, Ben, I thank you again. Last night, I offered an amendment that would have said change of venue or at least let's do a strategy to change the venue for the Olympics. And it lost on a party line vote in the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. The Republicans all voted for it. The Democrats all voted against it. So the fix seems to be in with the Biden administration, just do a diplomatic boycott. And I think that is so grossly inadequate, juxtaposed with what's going on in Hong Kong, what's going on throughout all of China, and the Beijing Genocide Olympics, what is going on in Xinjiang. So thank you, Ben, and I can gladly go into greater detail about some of these other things.
Well, Congressman, thank you very much indeed for both for those remarks and for your leadership on all of these issues. And I know you may have to leave us at some point before the end, but if you're able to stay for some of the Q&A, we'd love to have you for as long as you can. So thank you so much. Just before I invite Jenny Kwan, just to remind participants that you can send questions in through the chat function to me, and when we come to the Q&A, I'll go through those. Jenny Kwan, it's wonderful to have you with us as well, particularly as I know it's early in the morning where you are. And we particularly look forward to your remarks because, first of all, Canada, of course, is a very important ally in this. You have one of the largest populations of Hong Kongers outside Hong Kong, and increasingly so with Canada's lifeboat scheme that's been offered alongside the UK's BNO scheme. But of course, you also were born in Hong Kong, so you come at this issue from those two perspectives, and we're delighted to have you with us. Over to you. Oh, I think you may be on mute.
Can you hear me now?
We can, yes, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much, Ben, for that very kind introduction. It's my pleasure to join with the distinguished panelists. A big thank you to Hong Kong Watch for the incredible work that you're doing in shining a spotlight with the situation, the escalating situation in Hong Kong and the deteriorating situation in Hong Kong. And indeed, what a dark day it is for the people of Hong Kong. And myself, as you've indicated, was born in Hong Kong. And as I watched the situation unfold, it literally is breaking my heart to see what is going on. A year ago, as we know, the national security law came into effect, shattering China's international commitment to the promise of one country, two systems for the people of Hong Kong. And under the national security law, people are being arbitrarily arrested without bail. And in effect, Hong Kong has become a police state. As we watch things unfold, Hong Kong's autonomy has been annihilated and its people have lost even the most basic human rights and freedom. Things have escalated so much that Apple Daily, after 26 years of operation, shut down their website and printed their last newspaper on June 26. The owner, Lai, has been jailed, and some of the directors and senior journalists have been arrested. Effectively, journalistic freedom is a thing of the past in Hong Kong. And you can safely assume that any news coming out of Hong Kong media outlets now will be a sanitized version. On this 24th anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong, China is telling the world that they have no regard to their commitment to the Sino-British Joint Declaration, an international treaty registered by the United Nations, is not worth the paper it's written on. China is showing the world that their word can change on a dime. The initial claim that the national security law will be enacted in accordance with Hong Kong Basic Law is a farce. The notion that it cannot be applied retroactively is false. The application of the law is clearly subjected to the whim of the Chinese government, and anyone could be targeted. The focus is to shut down all dissenting opinion. And by smashing to pieces Hong Kong's autonomy under the promise of one country, two systems, there is a massive exodus of Hong Kongers fleeing persecution through immigration, whether it be to the UK or to Germany or other countries, though I fear that the window to get to safety is fast closing, with the exit ban coming into effect on August 1st. In comparing the measures taken by the UK government, for example, to help Hong Kongers versus that of the Canadian government, I must admit, I am bitterly disappointed. The situation is more urgent than ever, yet the measures announced by the Canadian government to date do not offer any support to Hong Kongers who are still abroad but are at risk of persecution. The people of Hong Kong need more than just economic immigration measures. the current crisis in Hong Kong should not be about Canada, how Canada can benefit from Hong Kongers economically, but about how Canada can support those fleeing political persecution. The call for action for humanitarian measures for the Canadian government, from the Canadian government for the people of Hong Kong, was supported by the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration. In fact, the committee tabled its report entitled Safe Haven in Canada, Special Immigration and Refugee Measures are urgently needed for the people of Hong Kong. And there were no dissenting opinions or reports that were tabled with this report. What that means is the committee, in its majority, supported the recommendations in that report. The committee actually heard from a wide ranging of witnesses who share their experiences with us. And without a doubt, a clear message from the witnesses is that the current immigration measures from the Canadian government is deficient to support the people of Hong Kong. Witnesses urgently call for the government to expand humanitarian measures to Hong Kongers before August 1st, 2021. Canada must come to grips with the fact that it is impossible for Hong Kongers abroad to obtain a UNHCR certification of refugees. And to support the people of Hong Kong at this critical juncture, it is imperative that the Canadian Minister of Immigration create a temporary public policy to grant refugee status to pro-democracy activists within Hong Kong and within third countries, which will enable the resettlement to Canada. Time is of the essence, and the Minister of Immigration needs to use his discretionary powers to issue ministerial permits to Hong Kongers, similar to measures that were used for those fleeing China after the Tiananmen Square massacre. Canada must issue travel documents as well to Hong Kongers at risk of persecution and exempt them from non-essential pandemic travel restrictions following public health guidelines. And to supplement these humanitarian measures, the Canadian government should also expand the family reunification measures to extended family members. If immediate action is not taken, I fear that it will be too late. And finally, Canada must not forget that there are over 300,000 Canadians in Hong Kong at the moment. And for some, they may have given up their Canadian status. But even if they didn't, given the national security law applies to anyone and everyone worldwide, their Canadian status, I believe, will not provide them with any protection. That is the reality. Every one of us sitting around this table, in fact, participating in this webinar today, we are in violation of the national security law. That's what it means. That's why it is so important for the allied countries, for all of us worldwide to gather together, to talk about this, to raise awareness about this, to think about what can be done and how we can fight back, not just for the people of Hong Kong, but for everyone across the globe. Democracy is the center of what makes us so great as a country, right? As nations. And that's what we have to strive for every country. And the truth is, what's happened with Hong Kong, while in the beginning where some of the protests occurred, and escalated, is centered around a fight against the extradition of Hong Kongers to China. The reality now is that China has come to Hong Kong in full force. The Hong Kong as I knew it growing up in Hong Kong is now gone. The Hong Kong as we understand it with the handover is now gone. And the truth of the matter is, I find myself in this situation where I don't believe that I will ever travel back to Hong Kong. I think that I could be arbitrarily detained for any reason, as we have seen with the two Michaels from Canada. And this is so sad in every sense of the word. And this is what's happened with these actions from China. There's no mistake about it.
Well, Jenny Kwan, thank you so much for that incredibly powerful those incredibly powerful remarks. And you absolutely hit the nail on the head with regard to the national security law. Indeed, a comment came in on the chat to me a little while ago, saying that even asking a question on the Facebook Live function of this event could put people in danger, and we're all mindful of that. So thank you for those remarks. And indeed, our next speaker, and thank you also for your support and leadership in Canada, Jenny, as well. And indeed, our next speaker, it's a privilege to welcome Ray Wong, a good friend of us at Hong Kong Watch. And Ray always has an incredibly valuable contribution to make. But it is significant, firstly, that we are not able to be joined for obvious reasons in this webinar by any activists inside Hong Kong, whereas about a year ago we would have been, and indeed we were. But for this webinar, we had to look to Hong Kong friends who are outside Hong Kong. It's also significant that Ray, of course, was as I mentioned earlier, the first Hong Konger to seek asylum and to be recognized as a refugee in Germany. When I lived in Hong Kong for the first 5 years after the handover, if anyone had said to me that Hong Kongers would be refugees in other countries, I would never have believed them. Indeed, I was involved in helping people coming to Hong Kong as refugees from other parts of Asia at that time. So, Ray, we're really glad that you are with us, and we look forward to what you have to say. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Ben, and thank you, Hong Kong Watch, for all the incredible works done for Hong Kong people and for Hong Kong. As a Hong Konger, we see very clearly that Hong Kong Watch has helped the issue of Hong Kong to become more international. And also, I would like to thank all the distinguished panelists for standing with Hong Kong people in support of our fight, which is very important for us Hong Kong people. Yeah, today marks the 24 years of the handover. I think it's very ironic that Hong Kong, once a city, a refuge for the victim of the Chinese Communist Party, has now become a place from which numerous people have no choice but to flee. This change signifies the very nature of the Chinese authoritarian regime. According to the Sino-British Joint Declaration, Hong Kong people were guaranteed for our freedoms, rights, democracy, and our way of living. Looking at the situation now in Hong Kong, what we see is that China broke basically every single promise they made to the people of Hong Kong. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, and freedom of assembly are wiped out by the draconian national security law. The closure of the pro-democracy newspaper Apple Daily, the prosecutions of the democracy activists, and the ban on the rally to few recent cases showing the deterioration of freedoms in Hong Kong. Our electoral right was taken away by the reforms inserted by the National People's Congress. Hong Kong people no longer feel safe in the city as the city turns to be a police state. Even worse is that there is no way for us Hong Kong people to hold China accountable for what they did and what they are doing to our city. There is basically no remedy explicated in the joint declarations against the breach of the treaty. What to do to China for its breach of the international treaty is the questions still hanging in the air, and I think it's way too long. We Hong Kong people are very grateful that a lot of Western countries, such as the Great Britain, Canada, Australia, and also the US is considering to offer a lifeboat scheme for Hong Kong people. We are grateful for the willingness. However, we all know that dealing with this increasingly suppressive regime, a rescued plan for people under its threat is only to cure the symptoms rather than solving the problem at root. For a very long time, many Western politicians and political scientists believe that by integrating China into the world economy and therefore become prosperous, China will eventually become a free democratic country with respect of human rights. But the painful consequence of this flawed China policy of the West is that we let CCP make use of the capital it gained from the free world in the past decades to suppress its own people. The downfall of Hong Kong is a matter of great regret for the free world and people who love the city. Nonetheless, the downfall doesn't mean the end of our fight. The question, what next for Hong Kong, is a very tough one. I, to be honest, in no positions to really give concrete answers. But one thing I can be certain is that we Hong Kong people will not give up on our fight for freedom, but also will grow stronger and stronger until the date we taste the victory. England's victory over Germany 2 days ago is a wonderful example. The victory since 1966 shows clearly that as long as people keep up the faith, someday history will definitely make a turn in favor of people who are persistent. In 2014, the Hong Kong government deployed tear gas against peaceful protesters, but people didn't back down. In 2016, they used baton and pepper spray. We still stood firm. In 2019, mass arrests, firing bullets have become their regular practice. We Hong Kong people also didn't back down. And I believe that every escalation of suppression from the Chinese authoritarian regime would only make us Hong Konger more resilient and stronger. And I believe someday all the Hong Konger who now currently couldn't go back to Hong Kong, like me and Jenny Kwan, could go back to Hong Kong with our allies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ray, for that incredibly powerful contribution. We really appreciate all that you continue to do, albeit from outside your home city. We have about 20 minutes now for Q&A, and I will try to get through as many questions as I can. Quite a few have come in, and perhaps more will come in as we go through this. But if I could start, partly because it's the theme that has dominated quite a lot of the contributions in the last few minutes, and also because I know Congressman Smith may not be able to stay until the very end. So a particular question for Congressman Smith. Could you tell us when you anticipate the US Safe Harbor Act to pass to help Hong Kongers who need refuge, who perhaps don't qualify for the UK's BNO scheme, to come to the US, and any other updates you can give on that?
Well, it's a great question, and obviously I'm an absolute supporter of it. I do think it's, we have problems in the United States Senate with filibusters and with people putting holds on legislation. I think it's, very, very widely supported by both Republicans and Democrats, but I can't give a date. But as soon as we can get it over the goal line, we will. And I think, following the very generous and humanitarian work on the part of the UK in inviting people to, make their home as a refugee away from Hong Kong, given how it's been repressed, we need to do likewise. We did it previously in a number of cases, including when the Vietnamese, the fall of Saigon, We brought in many, many refugees. Matter of fact, coincidentally, I actually went to High Island when there were some people still there who had been screened out as refugees, and I did a bill that became law to allow them to come over to reevaluate their refugee status. So I do think we were, you know, we're moving in the right direction, but we just got to get it done. And so ASAP.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I mean, I just don't.
Yeah, understood. Thank you. I'm going to ask a couple of other questions on a similar theme, one for Jenny Kwan and one for Sir Malcolm, on the whole question of lifeboat schemes, before we then go on to some other separate themes. Jenny Kwan, there's a specific question saying that Canada is asking applicants for open work permits to provide police certificates. And of course, if you've been a protester or even simply an Apple Daily journalist, potentially, they could be at risk of arrest if they ask the police to provide them with that certificate. So what are your thoughts on how to get around that to enable people to come to Canada without putting themselves in that danger?
Yes, part of the immigration process from the Canadian government is that there are medical checks as well as security checks, criminal checks. And so that's hence the requirement for the police certificate. The issue, of course, with that is that it puts a lot of people at risk. You're absolutely correct about it. And that's part of the problem, in my view, with the Canadian government approach to supporting the people of Hong Kong. We're only just sort of following many of our existing measures within the economic measures as though it's status quo. Things are not status quo, right? And the situation in Hong Kong is very dire. People, I would be very worried, to be frank, if I was a Hong Konger in Hong Kong at the moment, needing to exit Hong Kong to get to safety and to go through a immigration system where I would have to get that security check. You're alerting the Chinese government that you want to exit, and the minute you do that, you may as well, tell the world, right, that you're trying to flee persecution, and so so that is a problem. And that's why, for me, it is so important for the Canadian government to provide measures beyond the economic measures and to provide, in fact, refugee status measures. And one thing that the Canadian government can do immediately, actually, is to do what they have done when Tiananmen Square massacre occurred, and was to issue a minister's permit to people fleeing persecution. And that was widely used at that time. And I think the time has come for us to embark on similar measures right now, and for the people of Hong Kong. And I also think that the Canadian government needs to weigh some of these requirements in recognition of what's going on. And for some people in Hong Kong, they may even have lost their ability to travel because their documents may have been confiscated. And that's the other thing that I think the Canadian government can embark on, is to provide travel documents for those individuals.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So Malcolm, if I could put a couple of questions related to the UK's BNO policy together and ask you to comment on both of them. The first is that legislation in Hong Kong has been introduced effective from this August that gives the immigration authorities power to stop people leaving, much greater powers to stop people leaving. Would that, in your opinion, if it was used against BNO holders, be a violation of international law, and what could the UK do about that? And then secondly, I'm sure you're aware of the reports of HSBC freezing the assets of some people, and indeed the difficulties that BNO passport holders are having withdrawing their pension funds from Hong Kong. And it appears there's a policy to penalize them and deny them their pension funds. Again, what could the UK do about that?
Right. Well, I think on the HSBC point, there's been the behavior, not just of HSBC, I think also to some degree of Standard Chartered and one or two other companies that basically feel themselves under such pressure from the Chinese government they're trying to bend over backwards to do what they're told. And I think that is disgraceful because they're not Chinese companies. They should recognize an ethical obligation not to freeze the assets of people who, by any normal rule of law standard, are perfectly entitled to withdraw the assets they have in those banks. And I think the British government should be, they may be doing it already privately, but I hope very much that they're putting maximum pressure on HSBC and similar banks to cease behaving in that way. So far as the wider question you asked about the Hong Kong government trying to prevent people from leaving by putting barriers in their way, I mean, that in a sense demonstrates how good the initial announcement by the British government was, that it's really put the Chinese authorities on the spot. They realize that people can vote with their feet, and therefore that is why they're trying to create these problems. Now, it may be, I can't give you an instant legal view as to whether it's a breach of international law or not. I suspect they are trying to cover themselves in Hong Kong, but I would hope that the appeal court in Hong Kong itself, which as we speak still has considerable independence and autonomy, they may not have it for very much longer, but I hope they would strike down any such provision if it was clearly being introduced by the Hong Kong government under instructions from Beijing for political reasons and not for legitimate administrative reasons. So we know, I mean, there is no way that the United Kingdom government or the American government or any other government can, as it were, force the Chinese authorities to stop doing what they're doing. At the end of the day, they control the territory, but you can make them pay a price for it, and you can make them embarrassed by publicizing the way they're behaving in a clear and unambiguous way.
Thank you. Just staying with you, Sir Malcolm, before we go on perhaps to some broader questions for the panel as a whole. A question's come in addressed to you that says simply will, or maybe it should be should, but will the UK sue China for the breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration? Is there any mechanism for a legal redress?
Well, what we have here is an international treaty. The Chinese government like to say this is purely a historic document, and there is no business of the British government or anyone else raising this as a reason for the Chinese government to stop their current behavior. I mean, that is manifest nonsense. It's not a historic document. It's a treaty signed willingly by the Chinese government themselves, as well as the British government, which lasts for 50 years. So it's like any contract. If you introduce a contract binding someone, let us say for 20 or 30 years, you cannot halfway through that have one side saying, oh, that's purely a historic document, you have no right to it. Having said that, you can potentially go to an international court when treaties are being violated, but it depends on the terms of the treaty, and it also depends on whether the organization you would go to necessarily is going to act objectively, by which I mean, for example, it's a United Nations treaty. The United Nations sometimes, through no fault of its own, is politicized because a country like China, which has a veto on the Security Council, or Russia, or other authoritarian states, block the kind of action that would be taken and ought to be taken on its merits. So I'm not hugely optimistic that that route can be pursued. And of course, we know in any event, even if you did pursue it, and even if you got a ruling saying the Chinese were behaving unlawfully, they would just refuse to accept it, as they did in the South China Sea when they lost the arbitration on their behavior in that particular part of the world.
Thank you. A question that's just come in for Ray Wong. Ray, Germany and the European Union have, according to the questioner, and I agree with this, have not done much to help Hong Kongers other than, of course, recognizing your own situation, except issuing statements. Do you think that there's more that Germany and the EU can do, both on lifeboat or on other issues?
Yes, thank you, Ben. Definitely that I think a lot of Hong Kong people are sort of disappointed by the inactions of Germany as well as the EU But speaking of the inactions of Germany, the main issue here is that the current German chancellor is still holding an outdated image of China. She is still believing that in order to change China, we need to stay engaged with this country. Therefore, Germany is not really willing to take stronger measures to hold China accountable for to the people of Hong Kong. And at the EU level, things are much more complicated. Just a few weeks ago, there was a discussion about the lifeboat scheme at EU level for Hong Kong people, but Hungary blocked this lifeboat scheme. This reflects the fundamental structural flaw of the EU and experience with talking with MEPs, also with a German MP. They are also very upset that some European Union countries are not aligned with the majority to take a strong in topics about Uyghur and Taiwan. But this year, there will be the German federal elections. We can expect change. And also next year, there will be the French elections. And I hope after these two elections, the European China policy would have a significant change in favor of the people under the threat of China.
Thank you very much, Ray. I'm good. I think we're down to the last few minutes, but I'd like, if I may, to squeeze in two final questions because I think they're important ones. The first I'll direct to both Ray and Jenny. And then the final question I'll ask all of the panel to respond to. So for both Jenny and Ray, a question it came in a slightly different form. I'm going to slightly reinterpret it, not in the way that Beijing reinterprets things, but just to expand it. What can be done as more Hong Kongers go into exile, whether that's in the UK and Canada, the US or elsewhere? What can be done to keep Hong Kong culture and the spirit of Hong Kong alive, and the dream of Hong Kong's freedoms as well, whilst at the same time people adapt and integrate into their new homes? Jenny, would you like to go first and then Ray?
Certainly, I think that here in Canada, under the multicultural society and policy that we have, I often say this, we're very lucky that we are the faces of the world here in Canada. And so the culture of Hong Kong, if you will, is very much alive here in Canada, especially in some parts of our communities. In Richmond, for example, you know, there are days that if you walked into a mall or a shopping district there, you wouldn't know the difference. You know, and it's very much alive and thriving in that regard. Now, I would be remiss if I don't point out, though, obviously there are issues with racism and discrimination, and these are the issues that we must continue to fight for all communities as well. And I would say this, for the people of Hong Kong who are still in Hong Kong, while you know, it's so distressing to see what is unfolding before us and what is really required, I think, because they are being silenced in Hong Kong. They are not able to speak up because of the draconian measures that are being brought forward under the national security law. It is incumbent on us to raise the issues. It's incumbent on us here where we still can raise the issues and be that voice to amplify their situation and bring together allies in the call for action. Aside from lifeboat schemes, which is absolutely paramount, no question, but as Ray has indicated, we also need to get to the source of the issue, and so other measures need to come into play, whether it be the Magnitsky Act sanctions and other measures. We need to actually put our heads together and as allies walk together in a unified way to send a clear message to China that what they're doing is simply not acceptable.
Thank you. Ray.
Yeah, I think basically every Hong Kong overseas is asking the same questions because we more or less realize that this question is at the heart of our whole movement, how to persist, how to keep up our spirit. And I'd often ask myself why I would identify myself as a Hong Konger instead of maybe after a few years living in Germany, I identify myself as German, why I don't identify myself as Chinese. I think there are something unique in Hong Kongness, our culture, our language, our sense of humor, and our history. And what we could do to preserve our Hong Kongness is, in my opinion, to study it, to find out what does it mean to be a Hong Konger, what does it mean to have this Hong Kong identity. What exactly is Hong Kong culture? And I think there are numerous scholars studying Hong Kong history, Hong Kong political issues, but there are not many scholars interested in studying our culture because for a very long time, most of the people just consider Hong Kong culture as a mix of British culture and Chinese culture. But this combination is exactly what makes us unique. And I think Hong Kong studies is something all the Hong Kong overseas should consider and also should facilitate.
Thank you very much, Ray. Well, we are almost out of time, but I would like to ask one final wrap-up question, which in a sense, both Jenny Kwan and Congressman Smith earlier have touched on, but I'll perhaps expand it a little bit. How can the democratic world as a whole, our countries represented here, the UK, the US, Canada, Germany, the EU, Australia and others, strengthen their alliances as an alliance of democracies? We've heard some talk from President Biden about a summit of democracies, from Boris Johnson about expanding the G7 into a D10 of democracies. How can that be solidified into something really meaningful? And specifically, could those countries do more to coordinate targeted sanctions, which both Jenny and Congressman Smith have raised? Is it not time now to impose sanctions on those responsible for dismantling Hong Kong's freedoms? And perhaps I can go, and if you could maybe just take a minute or two each. I'll start with perhaps with Ray and Jenny, and then to the Congressman, and then give Sir Malcolm the final word. So Ray, a brief response to that.
I think sanctioning is definitely a way to hold China accountable for their human rights violations. But on the other hand, there is also an argument saying that sanctioning would also harm the people on the ground, even though targeting sanctions just target the officials. But what I wanted remind is that a lot of Hong Kong people during the movement in 2019 has already adopted a new strategy called Phoenixism, meaning if Hong Kong burned, then we want China burns with us. Meaning even though if sanctioning from the West would harm people on the ground, Hong Kong people are willing to take this cost in order to hold China accountable and to prevent similar tragedy from happening to Taiwan and other neighboring countries. So from a perspective of Hong Kong people, I think targeting sanctions is vital and essential for the West to hold China accountable.
Thank you. Jenny Kwan.
Just very quickly, no question. I think it is time for sanctions such as the Magnitsky sanctions to be put in play. There's no question that needs to be done, and that message needs to be sent. Allied countries needs to come together. I mean, aside from the situation in Hong Kong, it was talked about the human rights violations, the Uyghurs, the genocide that's going on there. We need to take a deep breath and say, hey, this is not okay. These are crimes against humanity, and we must stand together. And I think, if we stand together with actions together, we are so much stronger, right? And in fighting back to Hong Kong, yes, fighting back against China. China, of course, is a huge economy. We get that. But at the same time, you have to make that evaluation and make a determination. Do lives matter? And if it does, where do we stand and what action must we take? And as elected officials, it is our responsibility to act. So I do hope that the allied countries will come together. I hope that they are having these conversations and to say, where do we go from here? Because it's clear as day that what's happening in Hong Kong is a signal of what's more to come, because things are escalating. They're not de-escalating. And if we turn a blind eye to it, shame on us.
Thank you. Congressman Chris Smith, if you're still with us, a last word from you. I think the congressman is not.
I just got back. We
Oh.
just had another vote.
Oh.
I'm sorry to say.
Thank you. No.
So I missed almost everything in the last 15 minutes, so I apologize. What was the question?
Basically, just a last word from you on how the democratic world can coordinate more together, and particularly in regard to the importance of, is it time now for meaningful sanctions?
Absolutely on the meaningful sanctions. I mean, our Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act did call for Magnitsky-like sanctions, and that's good. In March, another 24 people were put on that sanctions list because of what they've done in and to Hong Kong. But it's still not enough. They believe, they being the Chinese dictatorship, they can weather this. And it's only a matter of when and not if that the international community grows weary and says, well, I guess we can work with you guys. And they just turn the page. And as somebody said earlier, I think, again, I've been in and out, so I apologize, but Hong Kong is in the crosshairs, not Hong Kong, Taiwan. And there's just what he gets away with, as it was famously said, they probe with bayonets, and that's what they're doing here. I do think that one of the sanctions that will bite the most, and it's not a sanction per se, but it would be to aggressively look to move the Olympics to another venue, remembering again that Kazakhstan got 40 votes in the IOC, China got 44, it was hardly a slam dunk. And some of the other countries that pulled out, I think they did it under pressure. I can't prove that, but it just had the look of pressure. And, I'm one of those, along with many others, that nominated Liu Xiaobo for the Nobel Peace Prize. I thought there should have been 3 who got it. Gao Zhejiang was another one. But that said, Norway took a great deal of backlash for that naming. Not only did they not allow Liu Xiaobo to come to the ceremony, but it was, there was an empty chair, and I was there. It was very, very heartbreaking. But he died in prison. They wait us out, and that's a lesson that has not been learned fully Our business community here in the United States, and I know in the European Union and the UK as well, they just think if you just trade, they're going to somehow improve. No, they're going to become more powerful and potent militarily, and that's without a doubt. I mean, so much of their command and control, Google, Cisco, everybody has enabled them, the surveillance state, courtesy of US technology and European and UK technology. So boycotting, again, I can't say this enough. When we do, which I think we're going to do, and that's a diplomatic boycott, that will do nothing. That's such a minimalist policy that Xi Jinping will have the big laugh, a barrel laugh over that one. It's either got to be a real boycott or best case, move it. If there was a new outbreak of COVID-19 or some facsimile thereof in Beijing, there would be a movement real quick based on that. Well, we have a man that's committing genocide and is breaking every promise the PRC made to the UK and to the world, and above all to the people of Hong Kong. And he's doing it in the plain light of day and getting away with it. So I think, you should see the pushback. I wanted to do a second hearing that has not happened yet, inviting the business community, those who are sponsors of the Beijing 2022 Olympics, the Genocide Olympics, to come and give an accounting for themselves. We asked the IOC, we asked the American affiliate to come. They wouldn't come. They sent some piece of junk, and it really was a statement, a couple-page statement about athletic competition. And all of us on this call are for, I love the Olympics, but not, when it's being run and hosted by a country that's committing such atrocities. So I think more seriously focusing on that, that will effectuate a serious loss of face for Xi Jinping, and that's important because he has gotten away with murder. Let's not forget, I said it a little bit earlier, but at the same time they were planning the genocide, and the New York Times and others exposed all of that, he said, "Show no mercy." This is back in 6 years ago. Crush these people, root and branch, as he said, and they're doing it in plain sight. So. I think all of us need to rally around because I think the default will be diplomatic boycott, and it won't do a thing. It'll make us feel better. Oh, we did something, but it will not have any impact, in my humble opinion. But I'm also introducing a bill. Last year we got a bill passed that said that anything coming out of Xinjiang is presumptively denied entry into the United States. Passed the House, did not pass the Senate, for the same reason why I expressed some concern over the safe harbor legislation. Marco Rubio is doing a great job, a wonderful, wonderful man who's committed to Chinese and Hong Kong human rights and democracy. But the Senate is a difficult place to get things passed. We have a similar initiative here. If the president were to become very vocal on that, it would be helpful. It might help get it through. But I do see a management of the issue rather than an embrace fully and unconditionally of the people of Hong Kong. And of course, we always want to be wise as serpents, as it says in the Holy Scriptures. We want to do no harm, but we got to do more. We have not done more. We've always, and the 2008 Olympics was a classic example, like I said, boy, did we try to stop that, and we couldn't. I met with Wei Jingsheng in the early 1990s in Beijing when he was let out briefly to get the Olympics 2000, which they did not get. When this high-value political prisoner didn't buy them the Olympics, they rearrested him and beat him almost to death. He came to the United States in 1997, and he sat right over here in my couch in my office and said, "You Americans don't get it. When you kowtow and when you coddle dictatorship," my words, but his sentiments, they beat us more in prison. They're harsher. You've got to be tough, predictable, so that when they look you in the eyes, they know you're not kidding. And again, diplomatic boycott says we're kidding. But sanctions, fuller sanctions, more robust sanctions, absolutely. The whole idea of the autonomy of Hong Kong, as from its economic point of view, especially, we've done much. Both administrations, Pompeo and now Blinken, to say it's not business as usual. So that's a good thing. But they think they can wait us out. And that's my biggest concern.
Thank you, Congressman, very much. Sir Malcolm Rifkind, last word from you.
Sure. You asked us to limit our comments to 1 or 2 minutes, so I will do that. And I'm only going to make I agree with a lot of what's been said. I just want to make 2 comments. First one is that what the Chinese government most hate is the rest of the world refusing to stop criticizing their behavior towards their own citizens. So what the democracies, but not just the democracies, have to do is to say, sorry, these are universal human rights. Your treatment of Hong Kong is a breach of an international treaty. You may not like it, but you're going to have to listen to it for week after week, month after month, year after year. And if it embarrasses you, that's your mistake. You'll have to sort that out. The second point I want to make, which has not been mentioned at all yet, one of the major areas of human rights violations are, of course, the Uyghurs. They're being persecuted because of their Muslim faith. How much public comment have we heard from the rest of the Muslim world? There are 30 or 40 countries which are either entirely Muslim or a vast majority of Muslim population. They have all either been bullied, bribed, or persuaded to say not a word of criticism and to vote against condemnation of the Chinese behavior against the Uyghurs. Can you imagine if the way that Uyghurs are being treated in China, if that was happening in the United States or the United Kingdom or any other Western country? Do we believe for a moment these governments of Muslim states would be silent? They'd be screaming with fury, total condemnation at every available opportunity. So it's not just the Chinese government who have to be shamed. On the particular issue of the treatment of the Uyghurs, the governments of all the Middle Eastern countries and the other countries in Pakistan and some of the Kazakhstan and these countries that have Muslim populations, Turkey, started off criticizing the Chinese until they were persuaded to stop the criticism by Beijing. So they should be shamed too, because they should be ashamed of themselves.
Thank you very much. That's an extremely important point on which to end, and a new point that you've brought in. This topic could consume us, and indeed does consume me every hour of every waking day. But we only allotted a certain time for this webinar, so we have come to the end. I want to thank our audience, first of all, everyone for participating, for the questions we've had, for those who've been brave enough to follow this, despite the dangers they may be putting themselves in wherever they are in the world, because of course the national security law has this extraterritorial application. But most of all, a big thank you to our distinguished panel. Thank you to Ray Wong, to Jenny Kwan, Congressman Chris Smith. We really appreciate on such a busy legislative day your time. And Sir Malcolm Rifkind, as always, thank you for your support and your excellent reflections and contributions. That brings us to the end on this historic, tragic, important day, and gives us a lot to not just think about, but go and work on for the people of Hong Kong. Thank you all very much.